Changing family lifestyles. How did urbanization affect family life and gender roles? College Board Topic 6.1, Contextualizing Industrialization and its Origins and Effects. Explain the context in which industrialization originated, developed, and spread in Europe. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by industrialization, depending on the level of industrial development in a particular location. Industrialization promoted the development of new classes in the industrial regions of Europe. Europe experienced rapid population growth and urbanization, leading to social dislocations. And over time, the Industrial Revolution altered the family structure and relations for bourgeois and working-class families. College Board Topic 6.4, Social Effects of Industrialization. Explain the causes and consequences of social developments resulting from industrialization. Bourgeois families became focused on the nuclear family and the cult of domesticity, with distinct gender roles for men and women. By the end of the century, higher wages, laws restricting the labor of women and children, social welfare programs, improved diet, and increased access to birth control affected the quality of life for the working class. Economic motivations for marriage, while still important for all classes, diminished as the middle-class notion of companionate marriage began to be adopted by the working classes. Leisure time centered increasingly on the family or small groups, concurrent with the development of activities and spaces to use that time. The place, Great Britain, Germany, France, Sweden, etc. The time frame, 1850s to 1914. Key concepts in changing family lifestyles: companionate marriage, the suffrage movement, separate spheres. Previously, we saw big changes happening between the 1780s and the 1850s. From the 1780s to the 1850s, there was lots of disruption. The entire economy was shifting from agricultural to industrial, from rural to urban. Families were forced to adapt to all of these economic changes, and a middle class emerged over time. And this middle class was different from the peasants, the workers, and from the aristocracy. And we've already talked about their occupations in the last lesson. The year 1850 marks a kind of turning point in their socio-economic development. But what about their values regarding family life and gender? The interesting thing about these values is this: these values started off as uniquely middle class, but then they spread to the other classes during this period as well. Marriage in the middle class. Love was not the highest value in a marriage before the 1850s. Other factors were considered more important in a marriage: economics, convenience, social reasons. And this was true for aristocratic as well as working class people. And notice, we're making a distinction here between aristocratic and working class at this point, because the middle class hasn't really shown up yet. However, by the 1850s, these emerging middle classes were doing something different: the companionate marriage. The middle classes in particular set love as the highest value in determining marriage. The media played a huge role in defining, reinforcing, and spreading these relatively new middle-class values and rituals. They had instruction manuals and popular romantic fiction and art. Courtship rituals developed, and these were strict rules about what was proper and what was not. Courtship behavior was closely supervised. They defined the boundaries between sex and marriage. When to marry. Men couldn't marry until their education was out of the way and their career was established. And some men never got to that point. But women were expected to marry right out of school. There was little chance for a career for them. What was the point? Your husband was already going to be established and prosperous. You didn't need your own career or your own property. The result? The husband was often much older than the wife. He was 10 to 15 years older than she was. He makes all the money. He has all the job status. All the property was his before they even met. And this seriously affected the dynamic of the marriage. The inequality is built into the cultural norms themselves. It's not a partnership of equals. She can't compete with the things he has, his life experience and his emotional maturity and his financial independence. It's really more of a parent-child relationship. And this inequity was reflected in the legal system. Property ownership was in the hands of the husband. Middle class and working class sex. Contemporary wisdom and contemporary science said that men had biological urges that women could never understand or relate to. In the middle classes, it was assumed that women would enter marriage with no sexual experience. Think of the iconic visit that the bride-to-be gets from the older married woman, like in the movies, in which she prepares the bride for what's going to happen on her wedding night. It was assumed that men would have some experience with sex. He doesn't get that visit that the bride gets. It's assumed he already knows what's going to happen. Now you're wondering, how is that going to work? Because you're doing the math and you can't figure that out. No problem. The middle classes have lots of options for getting the man previous sexual experience. Lower class women, domestic servants, and prostitutes. Before 1850, the working class didn't have these same norms and rituals and beliefs regarding sex. Premarital sex was much more acceptable for both men and women. Working class women were not seen as damaged goods by their own class if they had had premarital sex. About 1/3 of births were outside of marriage. But by the year 1850, the working class family was starting to stabilize. Literacy had increased. Illegitimate births had begun to decline. Pregnancy was increasingly resulting in marriage. Why? Economic prospects were finally improving for workers. Middle-class norms were also starting to seep into the working class. They're getting the same media messages as the middle classes. And marriage was seen as a sign of social respectability. Prostitution, 1850 to 1911. Prostitution was actually legal throughout most of Europe during this time. Instead of trying to destroy it, most governments chose to try to regulate it. And most countries actually registered their prostitutes and their brothels. Not surprisingly, working class people viewed prostitution differently from the way the middle classes did. It was seen as a way to make ends meet, very dangerous way, but it was seen as a stage of life. The idea was, you're not going to do it forever. When you get older, you're going to marry a working class man and have working class kids and leave that previous life far behind. Things started to change when these middle class values gained traction in society. Social reformers became more concerned with prostitution's effects on society. Prostitution was viewed as a dark, unwholesome practice. It harmed people. It spread disease. It spread crime. So government regulations started to become much more heavy-handed. Great Britain passed the Contagious Diseases Act in 1864. Registered women had to undergo invasive exams twice per week. And if they had anything, they were sent to a lock hospital, a hospital that you were literally locked in. Many prostitutes didn't want the kind of protection that went with being registered, and they chose to work off the grid. And male pimps emerged to provide safety for them. Homemaking after 1850. The culture of separate spheres increased for both husbands and wives. Men were the breadwinners, and women were the homemakers. And this was especially true for the middle classes. The expectations for the husband were this: you get the education, you earn the wages and provide, and you be active in politics and public life. But the expectations for the wife were, you're not supposed to work outside the home. You're not supposed to go outside the home alone. And you're supposed to act as wife, mother, and homemaker. Homes began to be designed with a separate spheres mentality to them, and they still are. There were separate rooms for family members. There was a separate parlor for entertaining. And the assumption was that such a design was what best served the needs of the homemaker. Servants provided the middle-class wife freedom to concentrate on making the home a haven of peace and comfort for the rest of the family. And this was reinforced by the media. There were lots of middle-class housekeeping manuals available. Working classes were challenged to keep up with the middle classes, which was a massive challenge for working-class women. By 1900, they had adopted many of these middle-class values. But working-class women had to be the primary homemakers and often had to work to contribute to the family income. And working-class husbands typically did no housework. Regarding food, working-class women struggled to put food on the table, and middle-class women did not struggle to put food on the table. Working-class women tried to make the house warm and congenial, but working-class men often preferred to spend evenings at the pub where the fun and the action were. Alcoholism and domestic violence often hindered the working-class wife's efforts to create a nice, peaceful home environment. So the big question is this: was the culture of separate spheres good or bad? Obviously, the bad part was this: it restricted women's opportunities and even their movements. And these limitations were the spark for women's rights movements. But the good part was this: the husband had the opportunity to concentrate on maximizing his value as a provider. He could cultivate his skills and his marketability, and he could work longer hours. The wife had the opportunity to accomplish vital work in the home. Running an urban household was complicated and time-consuming and required management skills. So the benefits, though, were better health for the family, better food for the family. The wife could shop for better ingredients. She could create better recipes at home. And it also meant better behavior of the kids. It increased the well-being of the family. The home was more inviting. The home was cleaner. The home was a source of pride. And it facilitated family ties. Child rearing. For the middle classes, there was earlier bonding now with small children. Parents were now more willing to make sacrifices for their kids, sacrificing their time, sacrificing their money, even sacrificing their freedom, for example, breastfeeding. Babies were becoming more important now, and women were becoming better mothers. They were more intentional about parenting, and there was more literature about how to do it right. Fathers were encouraged to invest their time and their emotions with their kids, and the number of abandoned foundlings decreased. Older children. Parents now limited the number of younger children they had for the sake of the older children they already had. Married women in the 1860s had an average of 6 kids, but married women in the 1890s had an average of 4 kids, and married women in the 1920s had an average of 2 to 3 kids. There was also a desire to improve the economic and social positions of the kids with things like music lessons and summer vacations, university educations, and dowries. More contraception was used, and that means birth control. I find a lot of 10th graders don't know what contraception is. Middle-class kids were under constant pressure. They endured relentless observation and supervision, and approval was often conditional upon performance, especially with distant fathers. And this caused many kids lots of anxiety. Working-class kids had much less pressure to perform. They worked at a much earlier age, they made their own money sooner, and they could leave home if conditions were too oppressive. Feminism. Why did it start? It was really hard for middle-class women to find paid employment outside the home. They were legally under their husband's authority. They had no legal rights. Their wages legally belonged to their husbands. And their access to education was very restricted. A woman couldn't own property in her own name. some women began to rebel against legalized and systematic discrimination. The feminist movement had two fronts to it. Number one, they campaigned for equal legal rights, such as family and property rights, access to higher education, a big one, the vote. And they argued especially on behalf of unmarried women and widows who have to support themselves. They also campaigned for equal employment opportunities. Women needed jobs that actually paid money. There was no shortage of non-paying work for middle-class women to do. And women needed jobs that gave them a sense of meaning and fulfillment. Feminism made progress over a period of decades. In the 1880s, they attained access to white-collar employment, particularly in the fields of teaching, nursing, and social work. And in 1882, women gained full property rights in Great Britain. The suffragettes decided that they needed to get aggressive if they were going to be heard and taken seriously. Their slogan was, "Deeds, not words." They held militant public demonstrations. They marched. They confronted politicians, even heckling members of parliament. They even vandalized. They often got arrested, and they often held hunger strikes in jail. The feminist movement had a very long, hard fight. They got lots of pushback and criticism from conservatives. Instead of Rush Limbaugh's term, feminazi, those who disparaged the movement called feminists the Shrieking sisterhood. One of the most famous British suffragettes was the activist Emmeline Pankhurst, who lived from 1858 to 1928. Both of her parents had been politically active, and she got involved in the women's suffrage movement at age 14. As a Poor Law Guardian, and that's an official for the Poor Law Commission, she was shocked at living conditions in her hometown of Manchester. Keep in mind that Manchester was one of those towns that we talked about that started off very tiny before the Industrial Revolution and then exploded in factories and pollution and overcrowding and horrible living conditions. Emmeline Pankhurst started out as a socialist, but she joined the Conservative Party later in response to the Russian Revolution. Her demonstrations were known for being physically confrontational, and she was arrested and put in prison many times. In incarceration, she would hold hunger strikes and often be force-fed. She had a squad of trained female bodyguards to protect her from police harassment. She died just 2 weeks before the Representative of the People Act, also known as the Equal Franchise Act, gave all women over 21 the right to vote in Britain. And today, her great-granddaughter, Helen Pankhurst, is still a women's rights activist. The feminist movement grew very large. By 1913, the Federation of German Women's Association had 470,000 members. And by 1906, the German Civil Code granted women substantial family and property rights. Franziska Tiberius, one of the first female doctors in the German Empire, was instrumental in getting women access to advanced education during this time. The feminist movement was often inspired by utopian socialism or even Marxism. Remember that Flora Tristan, our early proto-feminist and utopian socialist, believed that the pathway to workers' rights lay through women's rights. Marxist feminists teach the inverse. They teach that the liberation of working-class women can only happen if the entire working class is liberated, which makes sense if you think about it logically and sequentially. They view capitalism as much of the problem regarding gender inequality. Marxist feminists tended to discount the slow and modest gains of the middle-class bourgeois feminists. And feminism has made greater gains in countries where socialism is more popular. But more importantly, all of this shows that class consciousness entered into the feminist movement early.